50 historical facts from Red Dead Redemption 2. Number 11. Hot air balloons. It's kind of a shock when after 30 hours of playing the game on the ground, you start the mission Icarus and Friends, where you hop into a hot air balloon and rise into the sky. The best vehicle I'd been on up to this point was the back of a horse, a train, or a stagecoach, and the highest height I'd seen was the top of a mountain. Now in a matter of minutes, I'd risen higher than a mountain. I was surprised. And if I was mildly surprised in the modern day, you can only imagine how someone felt in 1899. But while this was an incredible new invention in the backward Wild West, by this point, hot air balloons had been around for 116 years. Invented in France in 1783 and originally made of paper with a regular wood fireplace as its propellant, the hot air balloon was an immediate breakout success. This was the first time man could reliably touch the sky, and so it took Europe by storm. Wealthy aristocrats began taking and recording their ascents. Scientists found ways to rise higher and higher, and military strategists figured out they could use them in war. During the War of the First Coalition in 1794, the French used them to great effect against the Austrians. And it didn't just stop there. During the Civil War, they were used to great effect as well. Attached to telegraph lines, they could immediately relay the positions of Confederate armies from high above. And because hot air balloons are so safe, this was considered a reliable way to scout, to travel, and to see the land. By 1899, the game shows this. It was a calm, relaxing way to travel. And it wasn't until experiments with other chemicals and building techniques that a true disaster would finally strike. Number 12 and 13. Electricity and other modern amenities. I was pretty surprised when I noticed, while traveling through Valentine late at night, that electric light bulbs shone from the power poles. Curious, I followed the power lines to their source, and from there to every town in the game, and found that 6 of 10 towns are fed electricity directly from Saint Denis. Particularly the Lannick Electric Company on Frontier Street. Now you might think it's weird that Saint Denis feeds power so far across the map, but this wasn't unheard of. In 1896, Nikola Tesla established a hydroelectric power plant on Niagara Falls, which reliably carried electricity all the way across the state of New York to New York City, where it provided electricity to the elevated railways, the underground subways, and even lit the lights on Broadway. In truth, by the 1890s, as well as a telegram, every town that lied along a railroad line would have been entitled to electricity. At least along the streets. As I said before, the 19th century was an age of inventions. Looking through the lens of history, daily life pretty much transformed overnight. Of course, there were still holdovers from older ages, but thanks to inventions like electricity, those would soon fade as well. The light bulb provided more reliable light and allowed people to stay up later in the night. The electric trolley provided more reliable transportation through the massive cities and their ever-thickening traffic. The telephone would soon supplant the telegraph. The electric assembly line would one day revolutionize the creation of guns and cars, and the realization that electric waves could carry through the air around us led to the creation of the first radio. And according to Red Dead Redemption 2, the creation of the world's first robot as well.
He lives! My son lives!
Number 14 and 15. Coal mining and oil. Out of all the places in Red Dead 2, besides the Wapiti Reservation, I'd say Annisburg is the most depressing. Remember when I said life as a 19th century city dweller is probably the worst way you could live? Well, imagine you live in a city where every single one of your colleagues makes the same pittance you do. The city's aristocrats are your bosses, and your entire life is tied up in a mine. That's the grim reality of the company town. A late 19th century concept where instead of drawing workers for the mines from nearby towns and cities, a mining company formed a town of its own, populating it with the poor and the desperate, and ruling it with an iron fist. It's pretty realistic that the Pinkertons are here late in the game, because as unions were on the rise, it became one of the Pinkertons' main jobs to break union strikes against the awful working conditions. They were so good at taking away the workers' voices that the anger eventually boiled over into full-on armed rebellion in the Coal Wars of the 1890s to the 1920s. But as you would guess, the US Army was sent in, and through ruthless brutality, they suppressed these revolts. All in the name of that coveted Black Aqueduct. Of course, you know all about oil. Black gold, which when its importance was discovered in the mid-19th century, became the most sought-after commodity in the world. By the late 1800s, finding a single oil well was enough to set you up for life. So you can only imagine how rich someone was if they owned them all. Enter John D. Rockefeller, who got into the oil business right after the Civil War, long before it was so sought after. Even though it was only used for kerosene lamps and a few other things, Rockefeller believed that one day the oil industry would be huge, and thus he bought out every refinery he could. So when oil did become huge, he owned 90% of oil production in America, making him easily the richest person in history, besides maybe Mansa Musa, with a wealth that put even these guys to shame. It's clear that Leviticus Cornwall is based directly on him, because just as Rockefeller purchased railway companies to make the shipment of oil easier, Leviticus Cornwall owns the railway companies in the game. Though I'm sure after being smart enough to build all this, I doubt John D. Rockefeller would have been stupid enough to stare down the gun barrels of angry outlaws. What did he expect to happen?
You sure? Good. I prefer it this way. You've lost your man! Noise, Arthur! Noise!
Number 16 and 17. Art movements, American and French. You might be surprised to learn that as reference for the incredible beauty in Red Dead Redemption 2, not only did Rockstar refer to the actual states each fictional state is based on, but they also took inspiration from a 19th century American art movement, the Hudson River School. In order to achieve the over-the-top beauty in the game, there's no better place they could have looked, because the Hudson River School was a romantic art movement, and Romanticism was a movement that at its core was about landscape painting. Taking a beautiful landscape and painting it realistically, but embellishing it to the point that it was more than beautiful, to the point where it seemed touched by God. Romanticism spread like wildfire in the 1800s because it was a direct response to the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. It showcased the infinite beauty of nature and espoused the belief that peaceful harmony with the earth, instead of endless technological advancement, was the true way for humanity to move forward. So it's actually perfect that Rockstar referred to the Romantic movement, because not only does it perfectly fit their vision for how the game's landscape should look, but it perfectly fits the story's theme as well. So it's doubly fitting that when you arrive in Saint Denis, you're introduced to the new, more contemporary French art movements, objectivism and realism. Well, you're not really shown much art at all, except for what you see in the series of side quests The Artist Way, 1 through 4. Here, you meet the French artist Charles Chatanet, who's come to Saint Denis after being rejected by the art world in Paris. As soon as I started this side quest, I can immediately tell he's based on the real French artist, Paul Gauguin. He too was rejected by the Parisian art world in his time, though not at all for the same reasons. Charles Chatanet is something of a seductionist, talking countless wives, daughters, and apparently even husbands into the bedroom.
Hey, you got a picture of my wife here, in her delicates.
Henry, is that your behind? Why would you be showing it to that man?
That's my mama. As nude as the day she was born.
It's pretty self-explanatory why he was run out of Paris, just as he's run out of Saint Denis in the game. And it's even more self-explanatory for Paul Gauguin. Just look at his art. Yeah. Though he's beloved today by money launderers, Paul Gauguin wasn't accepted during his time. No one would buy his paintings, and after the collapse of France's economy and the aftermath of their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, he found it harder and harder to make ends meet. So he took his savings and made trips around the world, to Panama, Martinique, and his iconic resting place, Tahiti, where Charles Chatanet ends up in the game. It was there that his more exotic paintings and his extensive documentation of Tahitian mythology is what really made his name, and it's the reason we remember him today. Number 18 and 19, bounty hunting and execution. They say prostitution is the world's oldest profession, but I'd argue bounty hunting is even older. As long as there's something to get stolen or go missing, there's always someone who can get it back. The earliest written record of a bounty comes from a carving on a wall in the ancient Roman city Pompeii. A copper pot went missing from my shop. Anyone who returns it to me will be given 65 sestertii. 20 more will be given for information leading to the capture of the thief. But this was written as close as 79 AD, meaning that untold millions of these little bounties will remain lost to time. Bounty hunting in its more modern sense wouldn't come about until the 1700s and 1800s, with the occupation of the slave catcher, who honed their skills on the frontiers of the Americas and passed them down to the modern bounty hunter, who, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, found no shortage of game, hunting outlaws, escaped prisoners, and once again African Americans who ran away from sharecropping fields. These bounty hunters were half outlaws themselves, and so they could cross boundaries no lawman would dare. It was a cold, brutal profession, with the most common outcome for the men you captured being the death sentence. While the bounty hunter's a pretty damn old profession, the executioner is even older. The oldest known records of execution laws date back to the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi in the 1700s BC, where it outlines such execution methods as hanging, tossing in fire, and drowning in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Which is funny, because even 3,000 years later in the 1800s, the techniques weren't much different, with hanging in particular being the most efficient and widespread. Though in Red Dead Redemption 2, as shown in the side quest The Mercies of Knowledge, the electric chair was on the rise, as it was thought to be a more humane way to end someone's life, based on successful tests against animals, dogs, horses, and in 1903, notoriously, even an elephant. Number 20. The American Indian Wars. Late in the game, you go back north, make contact with the chief of the Wapiti Indians and his son, and become embroiled in the American Indian Wars. I put scare quotes around wars because in all my time learning history, I thought a war was a declaration of open hostilities between two powers that respect each other, and when those hostilities cease, both powers will write treaties and respect them. The American Indian Wars were not that. Almost from the second the first pilgrims stepped off the boat in the 1600s, open conflict with the Native Americans began, and it would continue pretty much non-stop from the 1600s all the way through to the 1920s. Through the 1700s, all the conflict with the Native Americans took place east of the Mississippi River, but as the natives were pushed farther and farther west, the 1800s saw the beginning of the most iconic time in the Native American genocide, the Great Plains era. Made famous by movies like Dances with Wolves, this is the age of the Sioux. Their great war chiefs Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, and their conflicts with the United States. The age is iconic because of how poetic it is. Noble Native Americans refusing to give up their defiance, even in the face of an overwhelming defeat. It's one of the most legendary stories of the Wild West, and so of course Rockstar had no choice but to put it in. But by 1899, the Sioux had been soundly defeated, and relegated to smaller and smaller parcels of land in North and South Dakota. This is shown in Ambarino, which is based on the Dakotas, where the Wapiti Indian Reservation is just a few acres in size, and the well-manned Fort Wallace breathes down their necks. Though the Wapiti tribe is fictional, it's clear they're supposed to be the Sioux, because they speak Lakota Sioux. In one mission, you have to find and retrieve the Chinoopa, a legendary Sioux ceremonial pipe, and their chief, Rain's Fall, is clearly based on the Great Sitting Bull, who, in his old age, adopted a conciliatory stance with the United States after his many hard-fought battles failed to stop American expansion into his people's land. But quickly, he realized even peaceful diplomacy didn't work. No, in truth, in the genocide of the Native American, there was nothing they could do but suffer and die. In the year 1800, 600,000 Native Americans lived in America, but by 1890, only 250,000 remained. Need I say more?